Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. My name's Rob, and today we're joined by Dr. Paul T. Miller, the professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Dr. Miller, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me on the show.
You recently wrote a dispatch article sort of arguing with yourself and just working through whether Trump is a fascist. Does he just sound like a fascist? Is he one? And that's what made me reach out to you, and we'll work a little bit through the article and then also expand more from that. But first and foremost, how do you take your coffee, or do you drink other caffeinated beverages?
I take my coffee straight. Coffee should be like life, dark, bitter, and hard to swallow.
I have not heard that, but that is great. What's your story? Give us a quick little bio about yourself and how you came to work at Georgetown University.
I've been teaching for about 15 years. Prior to that, I had a decade in federal service. I served in the Army, the CIA, and the White House on the National Security Council staff. Basically, 10 years working on the war in Afghanistan. And then I finished up my PhD and started teaching. I am a Christian. I'm married, got 3 kids, attend a local Southern Baptist church around the corner from our house. And I write. My most recent book is just coming out in a few months on the ethics of war from B&H Academic.
Do you have a favorite war movie?
Hmm. I suppose Saving Private Ryan. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's a very good and very powerful movie. I could make a case for the best Vietnam War era movie is Aliens, and I could do a whole podcast just on Aliens. Fantastic movie.
You have someone that served and oversaw war in Iraq. Do you have a favorite more modern war movie, or are those typically a little bit too Hollywood style
Yeah,
production?
there's surprisingly few movies set in Iraq or Afghanistan, and most of them are not terribly good. I do think American Sniper is a decent film. That was nominated for Best Picture, to my recollection. Hurt Locker is actually not a bad film. The best one set in Afghanistan, I think, is Lone Survivor, which, yeah, a little hard movie to watch. And then, of course, there's a Zero Dark 30, which is about the hunt for bin Laden. Pretty good movie, but I've only been able to watch it once in my life. It's a tough one to watch.
Very understood. How do you define fascism, and are there bad definitions?
Yeah, so famously, there's not a very good consensus definition of fascism. It is less doctrinaire and less ideological than communism, for example. We have a communist manifesto that tells us what communism is, but there's not really a fascist manifesto. It makes it a little bit harder to define it in words. Fascism is a little bit more about style and demeanor and attitude and theater and comportment and that sort of thing. It does have some commonalities in its various manifestations. It, of course, is about sort of single party authoritarianism under the leader of a single ruler. There's usually a kind of a cult of violence and a disparagement of weakness, liberalism, democracy, Marxism, socialism. Um, and yeah, there's a kind of obsession with national unity, national purity, a national kind of oneness. It talks a good game about tradition and culture, but it's actually a very revolutionary or new movement. It's not really hearkening back to the past because the past is too there's too many checks and balances. There's too much clutter from tradition to prevent the single party. There's nothing traditional about a single party rule. It is a very modern adaptation while borrowing a lot of the symbols of the past in a new way. So yeah, there's a lot of that's not a coherent definition because fascism isn't coherent. It is a package of attitudes cobbled together.
So would there be a bad definition of it, or at least is there one that you've seen that doesn't really jive well?
In contemporary discourse, fascist is the ultimate insult. Anytime somebody does something you don't like, you call them a fascist. That's a bad definition. Fascism is anything I don't like. That's a bad definition of fascism. And it's lazy and kind of frustrating because there really is something called fascism. There really are bad things out there, and words matter, and we should use them with some reasonable precision. And so the bad definition is to use it as a lazy insult for anything you don't like.
Case in point, next question is, has it just been used too much over the past decade? Kind of a boy cried wolf scenario? And if so, are there any kind of primary actors that you might blame, or has it just been used too much, if it's been used too much?
Well, I think we've seen it's not just the past decade. It's become a standard insult for 50 or more years. The left accuses the right of fascism every time the right says something halfway encouraging about authority, order, law, tradition, culture. And yes, the fascists tended to talk about those things, but lots of non-fascists did as well. And so there tends to be this the reductio ad Hitlerum. If you can tie the other side in some form or fashion to Hitler, therefore they're evil and wrong. Well, you know what? Hitler was a vegetarian, and that doesn't mean all vegetarians are Nazis. So that we should avoid that kind of lazy use of the word and be a little bit more precise with it if we can.
So case in point to your article and your definition, how has Trump talked like a fascist? Give us a few
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah, so a couple examples just pulled somewhat randomly. He talks about his political opponents and he literally says that they are vermin. They are the enemy within. They are the enemy of the people. And he's talking about Americans. He's talking about his domestic political opponents, his vermin. That's a pretty standard, fascist talking point, is to take your fellow citizens who are your political opponents and to dehumanize them by describing them in either animalistic terms or to describe them as a national security threat. You're taking domestic politics and making it existential and saying that the opposition is not merely wrong, but they are evil, seditious, traitorous. Trump uses that language all the time to talk about Democrats, to talk about the media. He calls the media the enemy of the people, and then he scapegoats an entire group. In this case, it's immigrants, and speaks of them with the same kind of vile language. That's again, very typical fascist thing. Of course, the Nazis scapegoated the Jews and Slavs and Roma and gays and communists. They had lots of groups and so Trump does the same with immigrants, with Marxists. It's kind of a standard talking point on the right to accuse anybody on the left of being a Marxist or a cultural Marxist, whatever that is. Yeah, so the scapegoating is another kind of fascist talking point. And I'll say as well, I think that Trump sometimes approaches fascist rhetoric with the way he talks about the nation and the way he talks about himself. The nation, again, fascists are sort of obsessed with national purity and oneness and unity. And Trump, his rhetoric is a little all over the place, but sometimes he'll get at that when he says, we don't really have a country anymore. And he talks about how whether it's immigrants or the left or whoever, are kind of polluting our country or diluting who we are. We're not going to have a country anymore. And then the way he talks about himself, I alone can fix it, he famously said. Or I think just before the election, he said something to this effect. He said that I am a political prisoner in a failing nation, but don't worry, it's like freedom is coming or something like that. Again, framing the domestic politics of our nation in existential terms. This is essentially equivalent to a civil war, and that the only way to win was through him. He was the one who's going to fix it and to save the nation and save what it means to be an American. He's really focusing very much on himself as the kind of national savior.
The as a semi counter to that, we also saw a lot of that existential talking points from the left, right? We had Kamala Harris using fascist to describe Donald Trump. It's now become parlance every 4 years. This is the most important election for our lifetime.
Yep.
So the kind of desensitizing to both that word and to just elections in general
Yep.
is personally sad to me.
Yeah. So, yes, both sides have used this existential rhetoric, which doesn't excuse it when the right does it. It just is to observe that both sides are heightening the rhetoric. The whataboutism, right is using fascist rhetoric, and you're responsible as well. The left is doing some of it too. That's not a defense. That's not a defense at all. That's just saying, well, yeah, actually, the right is guilty of it, but we're going to turn a blind eye because we don't like what the left is doing either. And I can dislike what both sides are doing, and I can criticize them both. And we should. I think neither party is serving us well. In this case, I think that the right is in charge of all three branches of government, and so I'm a bit more alarmed by the illiberalism on their side right now.
That makes sense. Critique the people who are currently or about to be in power.
Yeah.
How do Trump's policy positions, both from his first term and from this past campaign rhetoric, line up with other fascist movements or just authoritarian regimes,
Yeah.
past or present?
And this is what I tried to do in the article was I said, look, here's the rhetoric. Sounds pretty fascist. Let's look at the deeds. And it's a more complicated story there. And some years ago, I actually literally narrated the 1930s and looked at what the Nazis did. And Trump's nowhere near that. He's not, there's no Reichstag fire. There's no enabling act. He's not, he's not a Führer with unchecked power. So let's have a little bit of historical perspective here. Um, his first term in particular, the first 2 years, there's a lot of continuity because of the other people in his administration that really tried to slow roll some of Trump's initiatives. And Trump is a little too chaotic, dare I say, a little too incompetent to really, pull off fascism. It takes some discipline to do this. Now, his second time around, it's clear that he's prioritized personal loyalty among his appointees. So I'm concerned that his administration as a whole will be more effective, more competent, and that actually makes me a bit more scared about which direction it's going to go. Some of the things he's going to do, like if he just appoints more conservative judges, hey, I'll cheer that on. I'm a old-fashioned conservative. I like the conservative judges. That's not fascism. He's going to be a little, bellicose on the world stage. I think again, there's a logic to that. And if he pursues any kind of pro-life legislation, that's great, and that's not fascist or authoritarian. There's a whole lot of other stuff he's talked about, which could kind of go either way. This gets in the weeds, and it can be a little bit sort of policy wonky and maybe boring. But he's proposed this thing called Schedule F, which he actually put in place in the beginning of 2020, and Biden repealed it. The Schedule F recategorizes thousands of federal jobs from civil service jobs to political appointed jobs, which makes them much easier to hire and fire. And so Trump could have a much easier time enforcing personal loyalty across a much larger swath of the federal bureaucracy. It's a way of the president of acting with more control and cohesiveness over the executive branch. All right, now is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it authoritarianism? Is it fascism? Well, I think it could go either way. I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with the president having more cohesive control over the executive branch. I worked in the White House. I worked in the National Security Council, and I saw how the presidency is sometimes fairly weak, surprisingly weak, in his ability to sort of enforce his will on the bureaucracy. So I can see some logic to the Schedule F thing if you trust the guy in power. And I don't. I don't think any of us should. And so I'm concerned with what Trump will do with a more cohesive bureaucracy. So Schedule F isn't inherently authoritarian or fascist. But when you couple it with Trump's repeated threats to use the bureaucracy to punish his political opponents, he said this openly and repeatedly that he wants retribution against his political opponents. He's going to investigate them. He's going to prosecute them. He's going to throw them in jail. He's going to use the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS to investigate and prosecute his political opponents. That is classic authoritarianism. And Schedule F will make it easier for him to do that. So that's why I would be pretty concerned with some of the things Trump's proposed, even if you can make a defense for why the president should be able to act with more cohesiveness. The agenda he's got in mind is deeply worrying, and we should be cautious about it.
How does immigration come into this? That's obviously a big point, and even he himself and many people, I know some people who were Democrats who voted for Trump, mostly because they were working class, and between groceries and border policies, that seemed to be the two big driving points. Trump even said so in a recent MSNBC interview. It's like, I got elected for two things, grocery prices and illegal immigration. How do you see a somewhat maybe fascist slant towards immigration in general, or even illegal border crossings for his rhetoric?
So I wrote a book 10 years ago on American grand strategy. And in that book, I called for immigration controls. I said we should build a wall and have drones and sensors and surveillance. My concern was national security, right? It's just bad for national security to have an unprotected border. Having borders and protecting them is neither fascist nor authoritarian. It's simply what countries do. Every country in the world has borders. We should enforce ours and have a coherent immigration policy. You know, prevent illegal immigration, but I'd be in favor of a pretty welcoming, generous, legal immigration regime. We need it for the migrant labor and all that. So that's a normal thing. And I think everybody recognizes that. We've had irresponsible politicians in DC for decades refusing to do what Congress actually authorized this in 2006 under George W. Bush. They authorized the border wall and then refused to pay for it. We all knew that since there was no responsible solution, there would be an irresponsible solution. People would demagogue the issue, and that was true before Trump, and then Trump kind of was the master demagogue on the immigration issue. And what he's done is taken this clearly problematic policy issue, and he's demagogued it. He's used it as a wedge issue. He's driven fear, anger, and hatred towards immigrants. He's used it in terrible ways. Uh, so forcing immigration, not fascist, but the way you do it can be. And the family separation policy is unnecessarily cruel and barbaric. It is demeaning to human dignity and offensive to anybody who cares about family values. And yes, that kind of cruelty, that deliberate use of cruelty to frighten immigrants into not coming into this country, that's fascist. And if we see any readoption of that kind of policy, I would hope that Christians, the length and breadth of this land, would cry out in anger at what the administration does.
We are to be a Christian nation. We need to be accepting of the soldier. Just go look in Isaiah or Acts or Amos, any number one of those. Very, very good point, Dr. Miller.
Accepting of the sojourner. And look, some people on the left, I think, maybe misuse that to say we should just have open borders. Well, no, that's not what the Bible verse means. It means treat all people humanely. If you have to enforce a border, that's fine, but enforce it humanely. If you're going to detain people, detain them humanely. And the administration did not do that last time, and I'm afraid will not do it again this time.
January 6th has been described by a multitude of different adjectives: insurrection, leaderless attack, coup d'etat. What word would you use to describe what happened at the Capitol on January 6, 2021?
So I teach international relations. I study lots of political phenomena, and I spent 10 years working on Afghanistan and fighting the war on terror. And we debated all kinds of definitions about insurgency and assassination and war and civil war and rebellion. Turns out that we have a word for the use of political violence as a psychological tool to intimidate or frighten a government into changing its policy. The word is terrorism. When you use violence against a government target to try to, as a psychological tool to intimidate or terrorize lawmakers into changing policy, that is an act of terrorism. It was poorly executed. It was incompetent, which is why it was not more effective, but it was clearly an act of terrorism. I don't particularly like calling it an insurrection. That makes it sound like you're trying regime change to unseat the government, which is not quite what they were doing. They were trying to overturn an election and keep a president in power unlawfully. But it was an act of terrorism. It was the use of violence to change policy through terror. And I know most of the country doesn't see it that way, right? I've had conversations with people. So people inside Washington, D.C. tend to have one view of January 6th, and people living in the rest of the country tend to see it in much different terms. I think it's just because it was, essentially in our neighborhood. My wife used to work on Capitol Hill, and we used to actually go to church 2-3 blocks from the Capitol building itself. And so it just feels far closer to home for us. I have no sense of humor about this, and I give no quarter, and I have no grace for this. January 6th was a terrorist attack, and there was a lot of motivations. There was a lot of ideologies at play. There was some white nationalism. There was some anarchism. There was some conspiracy theories, and there was some Christian nationalism. The January 6th attackers, when they broke into the building and beat 150 police officers bloody, the leaders made it to the floor of the U.S. Senate, and then they prayed. And you can find this prayer on YouTube. It's not hard to find. Somebody shouts out and says, Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. And then they pray and they thank God for, I think they said, thank you, Lord, for allowing patriots to take this country back because this is our nation. So it was a terrorist attack in Jesus' name. And again, every Christian in the world should be offended by that because we Christians, the church, should be the body of Christ, the bearers of Christ's name, the ones who image him to the rest of the world, not terrorists attacking the US Capitol to subvert democracy.
Talking to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, I can very much empathize with that understanding. The way people now use Charlottesville as a shorthand for that rally is really pains me every time I hear that on
Yeah.
national or international podcasts or discussions. So I get that. You've already expressed some worries about a second Trump term. Are there any other problems that you foresee about the incoming administration?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the proposed pardons for the January 6th, rioters or attackers. This has been in the news recently. I mean, on the campaign trail, he suggested it, and then just in the last couple of days, particularly since President Biden pardoned his son, Hunter, Trump has again raised the idea of pardoning the J6ers. I think that would be the most clearly sort of fascist policy that Trump might pursue because it would legitimize political violence done in his name, right? If he pardons them, particularly if he pardons those convicted of violent crimes, of beating the police officers, and pardons those convicted of seditious conspiracy. There was 24 or so convicted on that charge. 1,500 people have been arrested. Most of them have been charged and convicted with disrupting a federal proceeding and trespassing on a federal property. Fairly minor charges. If Trump pardons the violence, assault and battery of police officers, seditious conspiracy, he's openly telling his supporters that they will have legal impunity for anything they do in his cause. I can't give you a better dictionary definition of fascism than that. He's turning the MAGA movement into brown shirts. Hitler's brown shirts, right? The militia, the civilian volunteer militia that went around as the muscle for the Nazi party. Yeah, you don't get more fascist than that. So if he pardons the MAGA and says violence done in my cause is okay, textbook fascism right there.
Are there any hopes you have for Trump's second term?
Any hopes I have? Look, as I said, judges, whatever, that's fine. I have no beef with the judges he appointed in his first term. I'm actually wondering if he may back off his sort of alliance essentially with the conservative legal movement. We'll see. Other hopes? No, not really. I don't. I have such large fears and concerns as to dwarf whatever good might come of administration. In the first term, one of the few good things to come out of the first term was the Abraham Accords that he negotiated in the Middle East. That's off the table, right? With the war between Israel and Hamas that is threatening to escalate into a wider war. We're not going to see any progress on the Abraham Accords. I'm deeply concerned that Trump's foreign policy will essentially allow Russia to win the war against Ukraine because he's talked about ending or winding down support for Ukraine in that war. That would be a disaster. Okay, here's a silver lining. I think Trump is largely right in his approach towards China. Trump and his team, Senator Marco Rubio now at the State Department and Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, they're very hawkish on China, and I think that's entirely appropriate. I think that the sort of competition with China is the most important, or that Ukraine war are the top two most important issues in the world agenda, and he's on the right side on this one. So yeah, maybe there's my hope is that Trump will lead to a more effective competition with China.
Are any of Biden's policies or even Harris's rhetoric equally as authoritarian or even socialist, communist, or whatever might be a leftist authoritarian ideology? Asked another way, do you see any parallels with the previous administration's policies or rhetoric to Trump's?
Well, I'd put it a different way. I agree that there are illiberal tendencies on the far left. And when I say illiberal, yes, I mean sort of authoritarian, right? Tendencies. But they're out of power right now. And the most authoritarian aspects were more cultural than legal, I think. And I'm talking about, I hate using the term, but I'm talking about wokeness, right? It's the sort of campus speech codes and cancel culture. That, by the way, those are real things. I'm grasping for better language to describe them. I don't like using the buzzwords, but there we have it. Cancel culture is real or was real. The thing is, I think we passed the peak of that a year or two ago. The Economist actually wrote an article somewhat recently about how we've passed peak woke. It's still there. I'm a university professor. I see this stuff all the time and I don't like it. But I also think that the fever broke. And so we're kind of moving in the right direction away from some of the most extreme excesses of the cultural left. I think I will continue to root for its defeat and try to be a part of a better solution in the university context. So the answer is yes. There's illiberalism to the left. There's illiberalism to the right. But look who's in power right now, and look which one is more clearly dangerous. I think it's the one that's occupying three branches of government.
Yeah, you would probably know something about college campus wokeness, especially since Fire ranked your university pretty low on
Yeah.
freedom of speech. But
Yeah, a couple years ago, there was an incident involving a professor at the Georgetown Law School, and Fire organized a letter, and I was one of, I think, only two Georgetown professors to sign the letter on his behalf. I've got some credentials here to speak out on in favor of free speech on college campuses. I will say this. I travel and speak on college campuses across the country. I get invited to come talk on this stuff or on Christian nationalism or on foreign policy. And so I've been to dozens of campuses and I ask everywhere. I ask everywhere, I said, what's the political temperature like on this campus? I just want to get a sense of how people are thinking and feeling and what's the sort of partisan balance. And you know what they all say? Without exception, every single college campus says this. Well, we're a little bit lefty, but we're not as crazy as everyone else. Yeah, there's this universal perception that universities generally are crazy, but ours is okay. And I just got to wonder if every college campus is actually okay, maybe the crazies are a much smaller minority than we all think. And I actually tend to think that's true. The truly crazy ones that we all see on CNN or whatever, they're on CNN because the cameras are looking for the crazy. It makes for really good clicks. People watch, they get all riled up. But they're a very small minority of the student population.
yeah, my personal feeling about peak woke, it probably started to die on October 8th, 2023, with just the amount of scenes you saw, honestly, throughout the world being at the very least anti-Israel, if not
Anti-Semitic,
pro
yeah.
pro Hamas and Hezbollah. So I think if there was a date for the start of the decline of peak woke, again, I also do not like the term because it doesn't have a great definition to be
Yeah.
had.
And by the way, it's the subject of a future book that I'm going to write about the illiberal left and its dangers to kind of to match the one I wrote about Christian nationalism and the illiberal right. I think it's appropriate to be fair and recognize the dangers on both sides, which is again not to imply an equivalence. They're bad in very different ways. The right tends to be more entrenched in sort of localities, in churches, and now in the government. The left is entrenched in universities, culture, the arts, Hollywood, and in corporate board HR, right? They own HR, and it's really, I hate it. And so they exercise their illiberalism in different ways and for different purposes. And again, I'm a bit more concerned about the about the rightward one right now. But the leftward stuff ain't going away. We may have passed peak woke, but it's in my research for this book, it ain't new. It's 100 years old at least. The kind of old progressive movement had the same kinds of illiberalisms to it. So it's just a perennial strand of American life.
Where do you see the Democrats going over the next 2 years? What do you perhaps hypothesize about their game plan against the Trump administration, considering that as we know, they will be at pretty low point in power brokerage over the next two
Yeah.
years?
So every time there's an election, I love this. I get Schadenfreude every 2 to 4 years because I get to really enjoy the losing party beating up on itself. I'm like, yeah, you deserve it. And in this case, you see the same debate always happens between the moderates and the sort of extremists. And in this case, it's on the left. So you have kind of moderate Democrats and the more ideological, pronounced kind of, woke Democrats having an argument about who's to blame. I think in a democracy where you have to win 51% of the vote, the extremists are always to blame. If you want to win 51% of the vote, you have to be moderate-ish to attract the median voter. And this is true of the Democrats, it's true of the Republicans as well. I think that if you really want 51%, which we haven't won since like 2004, you have to be able to appeal to a broad section of American society. And so I would definitely blame the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party. So I agree with all the postmortems that point the finger at the woke and the identity politics and the this and the that. I think it's entirely correct that they cost Harris the election. And if the Democrats want to do better, they should talk like normal people. They should throw out most of this identity politics garbage, and they should turn off Twitter. They should all get off Twitter and pay attention to what people actually care about, which ain't most of the cultural stuff. It is, inflation, and it's normal life, and it's just wanting a normal country instead of the insanity we've got.
Case in point, what should then the Democrats do to change the rhetoric and policies if they want to beat, assumingly, Vance in 2028?
If we had a Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy type of Democrat running a bit more on class than on race and gender.
Or even Bill Clinton. I mean, you saw him be able to change the Democrats a little bit
Yeah,
after they were out for
yeah.
3 election cycles, right?
I think that would command a bigger support. Now, please don't interpret this as me endorsing the Democratic Party platform, but I think that would be more electorally effective if they shifted in that direction. Didn't we see evidence where Trump expanded his coalition in all demographic groups, all races, ethnicities, genders, pretty much increased their vote for Donald Trump? I think people are just real tired of the whole identity politics game. And so Trump proved that you can get a lot of wide appeal by focusing on other issues. In his case, it was immigration and whatnot. But yeah, the Democrats need to follow suit.
Yeah, then New Jersey only went to the Democrats by like 4 points, right? Smallest percentage in I think since Reagan, which
Yeah,
is pretty astounding.
yeah, it's wild.
Are there any sort of Romney-like Republicans, aka fiscally and socially conservative, or do you think the Republicans now are somewhat socially libertarian and fiscally ambivalent, or maybe even fiscally liberal at this point?
Yeah, back in 2020, the party didn't even publish a platform. Their entire platform was re-elect Trump. I don't even know what the platform says anymore. I mean, who cares? Like, nobody takes the platform seriously. The party is whatever Trump says it is. They got rid of the pro-life platform even. So what does the Republican Party stand for? It stands for whatever Trump says so, which seems to be economic nationalism, right? He's been very consistent on that, and immigration restrictionism. And beyond that, I don't actually know what their beliefs are. They certainly don't care about fiscal responsibility. I think that's pretty clear. Are there any Romney Republicans left? I don't think so. I think that they've all left the party, and or they just kind of like fallen silent. I like a guy like Ben Sasse, right? Former senator from Nebraska. Now he's a professor down in Florida. I think maybe we're all waiting for another cycle or two to see what will happen in a post-Trump world, because not even Vance will be able to capture Trump's following. It's a very personal connection that Trump has with his people, and nobody will be able to capture that. And so I think in a post-Trump era, whether that's 28 or beyond, there'll be a bit of a free-for-all as we try to figure out if the party will welcome somebody like Ben Sasse back, or Mitt Romney, or what. I don't know. I don't think anybody has a clear idea of what it'll look like after Trump.
Yeah, it's going to be a roller coaster next 4 years, so buckle up.
The post-Trump world should have come on January 7th, 2021. The Congress should have impeached and removed him from office, and impeachment also bars you from running again. And 10 Republican senators could have swapped their vote and prevented Trump from running and prevented Trump from being president again. So we could have been in the post-Trump world already. If you ever doubt that, just a handful of people can change the course of history, 10 Republican senators would have changed the course of history. And we could have been in the post-Trump world already.
Yeah, my kind of site for who's to blame for Trump winning this would first be Republicans in January 2021, 60%. 30% would be Biden not saying he
Yep.
wasn't going to run,
Yep.
after the 2022 midterms, and
Yep.
then the Democrats picking not a very good candidate, Kamala Harris. I don't know who else they would have actually been able to pick, but she always tested bad. And I think in the political environment, it was already between woke language, immigration, and price of groceries. I think that that was just a
Yeah.
triple threat that I don't, as a postmortem, I don't think this was a winning election for any Democrats, really. So
It's I think particularly after Biden did not step down, I think it's probably right when he didn't step down at the midterms, right? When he said he was running again, hard to come back from that. If the Democrats had had 2 years to get ready and an open primary, even if Kamala Harris had come out on top in that primary, she would have been a better candidate. She'd been more well prepared. As it is, I think she did about the best she could have done in the, what was it, 2 months, 3 months that she had when Biden did step aside. I'm not trying to, I have no writ to defend the Democrats, but yeah, I think you're right that Biden deserves a huge amount of blame for this. I've got my own reasons for not having a high regard for Biden as a public servant. He bears a huge amount of blame for Afghanistan turning out the way it did, not just as president, but as vice president. He essentially torpedoed any good thing that might have come from Obama's policy on Afghanistan way back in 2009. I'm one of the few who thinks that Obama's surge in Afghanistan was actually a good idea, but Biden really did everything he could to undermine that by insisting it was failing, insisting we needed to end it and pull it out. And so when he came into office and pulled the plug on Afghanistan, it was the natural result of where he had been drifting for a decade. And I just, yeah, don't have a very high opinion of his legacy.
if there was an alternate world where Biden did pull out in 2021, or excuse me, in after the 2022 midterms, and just said he wasn't running, I think history would probably at least judge him more fairly. But at this point, I think
Yep.
even if the liberal establishment can in a few years try to rehabilitate his image, I think at least over the next 10 to 15 years, he's going to look at being a pretty poor president, at least in popular mindset.
His legacy overall will be failure in Afghanistan, failure to step aside, but then Ukraine. And in Ukraine, it's a bit more mixed. I think that Biden did the right thing by rallying an international coalition, supporting Ukraine. I think that he's been a little slow approving weapons. He's been a little more self-deterred than necessary. I'm afraid that his slowness has ensured that the war has just dragged on and on and on. A little bit more aggression at the early end might have actually helped Ukraine not merely defend itself, but actually push Russia back more than it has. So yeah, it's a mixed bag on Ukraine, but at least he's sort of held the line. At least Ukraine didn't fall apart.
If people are truly worried about a fascist America over the next 4 years, what should they do to prepare? And as much as I'm not a huge fan of this word, how could they even resist in
Yeah,
a
hashtag resist.
yeah, in a much more politically moderate or even legal way?
So look, if the most clear manifestations of fascism are all rhetorical, the way do you fight that is by refusing to participate in that rhetoric. Yes, let's keep an eye to make sure he doesn't do the fascist policy. And if he does, then let's pursue every means possible through the courts, by running for office, by doing all the things. But right now, the biggest threat that most of us see and experience is the political discourse, which is increasingly fascistic on the right. So don't participate, right? You've got to use words carefully. You've got to, I've got a sign up here in my office that says speaking the truth in love, right? And I try to remind myself of that. Look, I know I've gotten worked up here as in our conversation, but it's because we're talking about things that I think are important, matters of justice and injustice, of truth and falsehood, of maybe the health of our democracy. So it's good to be passionate, but in our passion, let's not stoop to an ad hominem. I think try to avoid name calling and try to avoid falling into the trap that the other side is laying for us of insisting that essentially your Trump says that his opponents are enemies of the nation. Well, don't act like one and don't fall into the trap of pointing the finger in the other direction. As Thomas Jefferson said, we are all Democrats, we are all Republicans. He said we're all Federalists. I think we're all Republicans. We are all, my friends, Americans. I've I fought a war against America's enemies, against Al Qaeda and the Taliban. And my enemies don't include Republicans or Democrats. That's what I'm trying to get across here. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that your fellow Americans are your enemies. They are political opponents, and they might stand for some really bad things. But if you fall into that trap, you're part of the problem, and you are furthering the deterioration of our political culture into nearly civil war. So don't do that. If you want to fight the fascization, if you want to fight the deterioration of our political culture, you have to help rebuild. Light a candle, don't curse the darkness. Speak as much as you can with truth and with grace and with patience.
Well, that's a great way to end. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for your advice. Thank you so much for walking through this, and we'll see everyone next week on Church Coffee.
It was an enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to come back sometime.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.